everyone. My name is Richard Lauer, and I'm from St. Lawrence University. And today I'm going to present on a paper that I'm working on with Kareem Khalifa called Placeholder Realism about Race. As the title of the paper suggests, we're interested in our central question in this paper is about the existence of race. And there's a lively discussion in social ontology about the existence of race. Our chief focus is going to not be on, a special class of these arguments for the existence of race that support the existence of race through its role in successful social science. And so the idea here is that much like the scientific realists might infer from our best natural scientific theories that there are certain contents to the world, one might try to do the same thing using our best social science. And given that race plays a role in our best social science, we should infer that there are races. And so despite the large role that this plays in other discussions about the existence of race, our aim is to take a broadly philosophy of science approach to this question and to look at these social scientific arguments and see how insights from the philosophy of measurement can be brought to bear on the soundness of these arguments and the interpretation of the conclusion of the argument in particular. So one of the things to note is that philosophers who have endorsed this thesis that race is real and that we can base race's reality on in its success in our best social science is that they endorse a kind of substantive realism. According to substantive realism, races are social kinds. And to be a social kind is to have a certain kind of causal structure, and that causal structure allows the concept to have explanatory power required to account for the phenomena that are generally of interest to social scientists. And so typically when race is posited as a social kind in these contexts, it's treated as something like a homeostatic property cluster or as a cluster of causally interdependent properties. And this is the thesis that we're going to press against in this paper. What we're going to offer in its stead is this thesis that we refer to as placeholder realism. According to placeholder realism, race is a placeholder for the actual causes of the phenomena, for example, the inequalities that social scientists are interested in explaining. So rather than positing that there is a kind that has causal structure, that has the explanatory power required to account for that phenomena, we're offering that race rather should be thought of as a stand-in for whatever the real causes are. These causes may involve, for example, processes of racialization or something like that, that lead to the phenomena that social scientists typically want to explain. So here's my plan for the talk. First, I'm going to review this in greater detail, social scientific arguments for the reality of race. Then I'm going to highlight that if social scientific arguments must account for race's metrological track record, that is its success as a measure. So we're going to look at specific measures of race and look at how they fare along certain important criteria for the success of measures. And finally, I will argue that placeholder realism fares better than substantive realism. So here's the argument. The social scientific realist argument for race is one that Kareem and I have discussed in another publication that's now forthcoming. And the argument goes roughly like this. The first premise simply states that social scientific race terms play a central role in successful social science. Second, that terms that play central roles in successful science refer. And then finally, it concludes that social scientific race terms therefore refer. This argument has some representation in the literature. We can see it implicitly or explicitly accepted among a few prominent contributors to the debate about the reality of race. In particular, we have, for example, Michael Root, who says that in the social sciences, race seems to be the independent variable of choice for school attainment, marital status, labor force participation, income, family size, arrest and conviction rates, residence, and political affiliation vary considerably with race in the US. And we have Ron Mallon, who's also a social scientific realist about race, who writes, the kinds that figure in the generalizations of our best science are real. And so there are others. For example, I'll discuss one of his views later. Harold Kincaid argues for the reality of race and a host of other entities like caste and class on the basis that there are good measures or successful measures of race, caste, and class, and so we can infer their reality. There are a couple of caveats that I would like to cover before I move on, and to make sure we unpack precisely. The first is to emphasize that social scientific realism about race concerns social scientific race terms. So it's crucial that it's about the social scientific concept of race. This concept could come apart from other concepts of race. So for example, many discussions about the reality of race that are not grounded in social science are frequently concerned with the folk or ordinary concept of race. There are also discussions where people contributing to the debate are interested in the biological concept of race. And so we want to highlight that our interest is in race and race terms as they appear in arguments that are in the social sciences and in those arguments that rely on race's role in the social sciences. Second is that we're going to help ourselves to, and our interlocutors as well help themselves to this frequently, to a simple causal theory of reference, according to which a term refers when if it's introduced into a community and it's used to pick out some property, and then from there there's a causal chain that where continued uses of the term are associated with the original usage, and so the reference is locked in to that causal chain. So in this case, yeah, we're going to treat race similarly. We're going to assume that race works this way. But where we're going to differ is in how we understand what this conclusion means. So though we're going to accept the simple descriptive theory, we're not necessarily going to agree that just because social scientific race terms refer, that they necessarily refer to a social kind. They may refer, they refer to something else, and we're going to suggest that they refer to those processes of racialization or the relevant causes of the social inequalities, for example, that social scientists seek to explain. So with those caveats in place, I want to make a case quickly that social scientific realists must make a case, must rely crucially on metrological success. That is, when we're thinking about the role that race plays, either as in evidential contexts or in explanatory contexts, we need to concern ourselves with the success of race as a measure. So the relevant central role then that we're going to be concerned with is metrological success. And as an instance to work from to see how and why we would rely on race as like measures of race ultimately for the relevant central role in success in social science, let's look at Kincaid's view. So Kincaid argues that we have reason to think that a system of classification or a specific construct picks out something real if A, it admits of multiple independent measures producing consistent results, and B, the category so measured allows us to identify causal influences and causal effects involving that category. So clearly A invokes an explicit reference to measurement, and it's important that those measurements converge. This is something that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail later on, specifically in the context of measures of race. But this other notion that the idea that we should be looking for successful causal explanatory relationships between different variables is going to be important, because this also requires that we think about race as a successful measure. In fact, the way we want to think about this is that causal explanatory success presupposes metrological success. So the idea then is that if causal explanatory success means having race as an independent variable in a well-confirmed causal model, then we have to assume that race is well measured, or that we have successful measures of race, because were we to have poorly measured independent variables, then we wouldn't have well-confirmed models. For example, one of the specific things that might emerge is that we have, for example, a high degree of measurement error in our independent variables. And if there's a high degree of measurement error, the possibility of confounding variables influencing influencing the results of a study are quite high. And so we would not consider those models to be well confirmed. And so this is a quick argument to say that when it comes to thinking about the role that race plays in social science, if the relevant role is causal explanatory success, there's a sense in which it seems that requires that we have successful measures of race. And so we need to consider that carefully as we're considering the social scientific argument. So now, with that said, with those quick arguments in place, what is it for a measure to be successful? So we looked here to Alistair Isaac's conditions on successful measurement that warrants realism, and he gives two. So the first is convergence, and he says that a measurement practice converges when procedures employing different theoretical commitments arrive at the same outcome. And then he gives us precision. A measurement is precise to the extent that it returns the same result when performed repeatedly. And so in this case, you can imagine something like a thermometer. We might have, for example, in the case of convergence, we might have an infrared thermometer and we might have a mercury thermometer. And they require different theoretical commitments, but they both involve the measurement of heat ultimately. And so what's important is that when we use both, they approximate the same value or hit the same value, and we can observe that, right? And so we would say that the mercury thermometer is a successful measure when it's able to converge with those other ones, or perhaps vice versa as well. And so the case of precision requires that we have consistency across time in the application of the same measures. So we shouldn't, for example, use the same thermometer and get dramatically different results, at which point we could reasonably challenge any assumptions about the reliability of the measure. And so what we should observe in a successful measure are both of these properties, that we can observe, for example, that there's convergence with other measures, and that we have a high degree of precision or increasing precision in our ability to use those measures. And so where does race come into the picture with this? This is important, right? So in the social sciences, typically there are what we'll call, there are a few different kinds of measures of race. We're going to focus on what we call structured self-reports and unstructured self-reports. And structured self-reports are self-reports that ask respondents based on a pre-existing set of categories where they believe they fit best. So if you've ever filled out certain job applications, or if you're a US citizen and you've completed the census recently, for example, you might have been asked, based on a set of options, which racial identity you most closely identify with. This contrasts with unstructured self-reports, where unstructured self-reports involve respondents being asked to identify, but without providing them with a set of options to choose from beforehand. So, and there is a third kind of measure, observer reports. And observer reports simply involve social scientists or survey givers assigning a race to an individual from a set of options. So, what does this look like in the case for, so let's look at structured self-reports, and so that you can get a sense of what this looks like, and then we'll contrast with unstructured self-reports. So for example, the census might, these are examples from the census. The census might ask you if you're white, black, or African, or Asian, but specifically note that when you're selecting these options, it's also asking you about your geographic origins. And so you would answer in accordance with those geographic origins, and you would then count as a member of that race for the Census Bureau purposes. In an unstructured self-report or an observer report, you may not have these categories at all. You're just asked, well, what's your race? And then someone's expected to give a response with respect to how they identify racially. So what we want to argue is that measures like these and the measures of race that we have run afoul of both convergence and precision criteria. So let's look at convergence first. This will be the more detailed argument, and then we'll go to precision, which will be a quicker argument. So here I want to focus on two different measures of race I've already noted above. Measures of race that come from the US Census Bureau, and those that were deployed for the General Social Survey. So the General Social Survey used unstructured self-reports. The US Census Bureau used structured self-reports. And so the GSS, when it recorded racial identities of individuals, ended up with a large number of categories. And I've listed some of those categories here below. So for example, you have white, black, or African American, seems pretty common, to people identifying as Hispanic, Wamanian, Native Hawaiian, Chamorro, for example. And so what we have in this case are two different measures, and those measures, they seem to converge some. So for example, we have white, black, and African American and Alaska Native people identified this way for the GSS, and the census structured self-reporting method seems to have those as categories. However, the census structured self-reporting method has includes, for example, omits Hispanics, which people identified as when they were asked for their race in the GSS, and counts Asian as a racial category and Pacific Islander as a racial category. But in the General Social Survey, Asian was frequently preempted by national origins rather than anybody identifying as Asian. So those who were asked would not say, "Hey, I'm Asian." They would identify as, say, some kind of national origin. And something similar happened with Pacific Islanders when they were asked to identify. They'd identify according to their island or country of origin, right? So this has the implication that in insofar as these are measures of race, the General Social Survey measures potentially dozens of races, many races, whereas the Census Bureau structured self-reporting method would seem to count fewer races. And so this suggests a lack of convergence. There is a further wrinkle, and I've not emphasized it here, but with Elias Saperstein has done studies showing that there is disagreement between self-reporting. There's an empirically significant disagreement between self-reporting and observer reporting of race. And depending on which measure you rely on, you could end up with different results using regression analyses, specifically on income data. And so what we have then is a lack of convergence between these different measures that is quite powerful. Not only does it show that we would quantify over different numbers of races between the different measures, there's also an empirically meaningful difference between these different measures. That is, we should expect different empirical results based on how people are identifying. And so it seems that the convergence requirement is not satisfied. So increasing precision allows for a much faster argument. So one thing to note is that one's racial identity, it could be coded as a number and receive a numerical value, but it wouldn't receive a numerical value in the way, say, that we would want to assign a numerical value to temperature if we were measuring temperature. Temperature fits on a scale, right? We move to one end, things get hotter. We move to the other end, things are cooler. And race doesn't seem to function that way. Rather, if there are numbers associated with specific races, they simply function as tags for perhaps coding purposes or something like that. And so it's difficult to isolate a coherent concept of being more precise in racial identification than that we can associate with race in the same way that we can associate with other kinds of measures like measuring temperature. And so it seems that we're running afoul of the precision requirement as well. So we have neither convergence nor precision in these measures, or at least we don't have increasing precision or an intelligible notion of increasing precision. And it seems that if substantive realism requires that race is a cluster of causally independent properties in this homeostatic property cluster sense, then we should expect that as social scientists are better able to generate empirically successful models, that our measures of race should also reflect sort of greater convergence and increasing precision. But we find neither. And so what we offer instead is that perhaps race is not a social kind. Given the way that it's measured, given the absence of those requirements for successful measure, it's perhaps better to treat it as a placeholder. It's a placeholder for those causes or causal processes that are responsible for the relevant inequalities. But given that we can't seem to lock onto anything like race in the world using our measures because we lack evidence for it, we lack convergence and precision, then we should infer that rather race is a placeholder. And so even though we can say that race terms refer, as in the original social scientific realist argument I gave, we cannot conclude that race is a social kind. And so the crucial bit here is that if what got us into trouble was requiring race to be a cluster of causally interdependent properties, well, we get out of it with placeholder realism because placeholder realism doesn't posit any kind of causal structure to races. It doesn't treat race as a social kind. And so we offer placeholder realism as our preferred alternative to the substantive realism of the social scientific realists. Right? And here are my sources, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much.